You're about to watch a recorded session from a live event brought to you by Lower Street, a podcast agency for brands. For more recordings like this or for information on other podcast events we have coming up, head to lowerstreet.co/events.
Right now, if you want to stand out in a pretty, let's be honest, crowded podcast landscape, content simply isn't enough. Especially content for the sake of content, low quality content, repurposed content that you're just putting out in the world just to make sure that it exists somewhere. You need to have a story. And today's session is all about storytelling and that story itself. But we ask, what makes that story stick? And how do you find the right story that connects with a brand and your audience? Now, it's so easy to say audience. We use this word constantly. It can feel kind of buzzy at times. But when I say that, I really mean the people you are talking to, the real people who are listening to your show. They're interested in your brand and or what you're doing. I want you to think about those folks today, that audience. And that's what this session is all about today. I'm excited to hand over the microphone to someone who can dive really deep into why story matters. And that person is the content director at Brand Storytelling, Jordan Kelley. Hey, Jordan. I'm going to let Jordan explain a lot more, but brand storytelling is a community for marketers and creators who believe brands should tell stories, not just run ads. They're all about content that connects, entertains, and adds, here's that word again, real value. Jordan, welcome. We're really excited to have you today.
Awesome, Nathan. Thank you so much. Really happy to be here. And hello to everyone tuning in today. Really looking forward to having a wonderful conversation right now. And am thrilled to be joined by Dara Kapoor, VP of Content at Wine Enthusiast and the mind behind Vinfamous, a true crime podcast that blends wine, crime, and unforgettable characters into a show that hooks listeners and deepens brand storytelling. It's one of my favorite podcast examples of a brand funded piece of storytelling, and I'm really looking forward to diving into that with her today. We're going to get into how Vinfamous went from a wild idea to an award-winning show and why storytelling first strategies are what set great brand shows apart. Dara, welcome. But before we do that, before we dive in, let's go ahead and set the mood, set the stage, and grab a little clip of Vinfamous.
The population here was shocked.
Backstories of envy, greed, and opportunity.
You start to wonder, well, what could have been done differently? Or are there things that should have been picked up earlier?
Was there an instance where they were doing things to the wine that could have potentially caused drug-induced effects or even poisoning, right?
And so I could have been a victim. If I went with him, I mean, I could have, who knows?
These are the stories we uncover at Vinfamous, a new wine enthusiast podcast about scandals, crimes, and history that have become infamous in the wine industry. Down a winding road in Napa Valley, two men were meeting in a barn at what was then Dahl Vineyards. From the outside, the winery and tasting room looked like a slice of the peaceful, idyllic Napa landscape. But inside the tasting room, the tone was growing tense between the two businessmen. Both sides had their lawyers on the phone.
He was greeted by Robert, and he was, according to Emad, very stern. His countenance was not pleasant.
That's David Weisblood, Emad Tafilis' lawyer. Emad invested $1.4 million in a dream Robert sold him on. But Emad had no idea where the money went. The conversation turned heated. A lawyer suggested they take a break. They hung up. Minutes passed. David started to call Emad. He's getting worried now. Then, an email hits his inbox. What happens next is Vinfamous.
There's a report of police activity at the winery. My heart's
Black gloves, there was duct tape, there was zip ties, and there was essentially a murder kit there at the winery.
Just a taste of what makes for a really fun and engaging podcast. I want to say before we dive in, Dara, that to me the thing that stands out the most is this quality of tapping into something that anybody anywhere, and especially folks with the intersection of the two interests that exist within that podcast, want to tune in and enjoy it. But I think that the thing that people skip over all too quickly is that a lot of groundwork has to be laid before you can get to a place where you have a great story to tell. So, as we begin this conversation, I kind of want to take us all the way back to the beginning and talk to you a little bit about why a brand wants to get into the podcast space in the first place and how that gets done. So, if you could tell us a little bit about not even just what inspired Vinfamous, but what inspired the idea to get into storytelling on your end.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I just want to thank everyone for having me here, Lower Street and Jordan. We go way back. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here. So I almost want to, it's hard not to giggle a bit when I see these trailers because Vinfamous came out a couple of years ago. So for me, it's like seeing an old friend. And it's when you ask what inspired it, I have to say that I approached this product from the lens of a consumer. I am the VP of content at Wine Enthusiast, which is both a media brand and a commerce company. And that's very unique. We're one of very few companies that does this. And I did not come up in the wine industry at all. So I came into this brand as a wine outsider. And so really I had no other hat to wear but the one of a consumer. And I came to this brand at a very wonderful time where we were still on the high of revenue being so high and brand interest being high because of COVID. A lot of companies experienced this. So I had some investment money and I was set at my boss, who's still my boss, is the publisher of Wine Enthusiast Media, which is Jacqueline Strum. She had said, you have some investment money for audio, go forth. And we have a podcast, the Wine Enthusiast podcast, which is a Q&A format. It's very insider baseball. It's wine geeks talking to wine geeks. And it's very easy, low production, very easy for us, our editors, to do while they're also running their day jobs of churning out really good content in our magazine and our website. So I kind of just wanted to try something new. I thought, hey, wine is something that I, as a general consumer out in this world, really enjoy, but I wouldn't necessarily assume that a brand like Wine Enthusiast would have something for me. And that's what I really wanted to capitalize on, was how can we reach people who enjoy drinking wine, but aren't necessarily seeking out our brand? How can we get into their awareness? And so that's how Vinfamous really came to be.
That's so interesting. So you saw yourself in the audience that you sought to connect with and decided, I think it's really interesting that you decided, okay, we have this entire piece that's speaking to a group who is very dialed into our world and our space. But just I think it's really savvy and interesting to go for another group of people, to work to reach an audience that maybe I wouldn't say out and out would feel alienated by what you were already reaching people with, but might not feel that that was for them. And so that is a great starting point. But how do you bridge the gap from, okay, I want to draw people in that potentially have, some other interest, to finding that intersectionality with the crime aspect of it all? Curious to hear why true crime.
A little bit of personal bias. I am a big Wondery listener, and some of my favorite podcasts have been of that narrative form. They really succeed. I'm thinking of, I worked at Health Magazine at the time that Dr. Death came out. I don't know if anybody in this room remembers it, but wow, what a story. I didn't need any visuals for it. And it reminded me of stories my father used to tell me about when he was a kid, getting around the radio at night for mystery stories. And I just would laugh and think, how could that possibly be interesting? It's not a TV. What do you mean? And a podcast like Dr. Death made it land for me that there are elements of great storytelling, no matter if it's a visual medium or an audio vehicle. And so for me, I really just broke down the factors that made something really interesting. What would make me want to keep listening for more? And I think some of the comments just showed, which very flattered by and appreciate, but like the suspense. And that suspense is built through not knowing what happens next, which crime lends itself to beautifully. History, which is things that happened in the past. They're a lot less maybe scary because it didn't happen today. So we're not so afraid to listen to it that we, need to have our security on as if we're watching Dateline and are afraid Manson's in the back corner. Not that scary, but just compelling enough where I'm going to learn something new and I'm going to figure out why something happened. And you build that tension with narrative devices like music and audio and different forms of audio, not just one person talking to you, but sound effects was another way to drive the story forward. So it was a real amalgam of things that I was personally interested in, and then seeing what was doing well in the podcasting space, which were things like true crime, history, and had a lot of special effects.
Interesting. And isn't it the way so often that when we lean on our own personal taste, we wind up with great outcomes when we ask ourselves that question of like, well, what would I want to listen to? That's kind of how we can arrive at some of the better choices and outcomes. Um, Now, I want to double back to something you said about having budget available for this because I think that, especially when we're talking about brands or folks who work in podcasts or make podcasts that want to partner with brands, there's an important piece of the puzzle that has to get discussed, which is, it's not always a direct A to B relationship between having budget available and creating that level of internal buy-in. So I'm wondering, you're told that this is something you can pursue. You have this idea. It sounds fun. It sounds great, but you do have a business objective to meet. And so I'm curious, how did you frame the value of storytelling like this for leadership internally at Wine Enthusiast?
Yeah, again, I consider myself very lucky to have a really encouraging manager who also, for being somebody who's steeped in business, also has a creative bone or two, a lot. And she understands and appreciates taking risks and that you do that through creativity. So I understand, I've worked at plenty of places where the people in charge are really suits and they only see numbers and you have to sell them harder on the power of storytelling. I didn't have as much of a fight there. But the way that I framed it is it would be an audience acquisition strategy. So it was never framed as revenue first. It was framed as brand or user acquisition first, brand awareness first. And Wine Enthusiast is a legacy company. It's been around for 40 years. And one of the challenges of a legacy brand is making sure new people are coming into your funnel and you're not repeatedly just speaking to the same person, because that will have attrition over time. So it was an easy sell for her, and we both assumed that getting sponsorship for it would be easier than it actually was. But we were on a song and a prayer and just great creative energy and ideas, and we said, let's do it.
I think you bring up a really interesting point, which is that there is always that aspect of the learning experience. Something we see at brand storytelling all the time when we talk to wonderful brand storytellers is that, even if and when they have the story that comes together, is delivered as beautifully as they imagined and all these other things, there is no road without its roadblocks. And so, frankly, unsurprising to hear that there were things along the way that maybe came as a surprise. Um, I do want to talk to you about this idea that, yes, there's a lot of benefit in having that internal buy-in and sharing that internal vision. And we can all get, when everybody's on board, it can be really exciting, especially when you have like such a succinct vision as you had. But then you run into the next step, which is, okay, now it's time to realize that vision. And I'm curious to know, once you had the green light, how did you go about shaping the creative strategy? You named a couple of the points that were interesting to you, which I think is huge. And any, observant podcast listener would be able to key in on those elements that stood out to you, but that doesn't necessarily translate to execution. So how do you go about shaping that creative strategy, and what considerations went into, realizing that and making sure that you're meeting that objective for brand growth and audience growth?
Absolutely. And this is another way I feel like the universe just came together in my favor for this to work out. As I mentioned, we have a podcast, the Wine Enthusiast podcast, which is editor conversations. So those are done in various locations from wherever the guest is located and wherever the host is located, with a recording device. And that's basically it. We don't have a podcast studio where we have access to audio editing tools or sound effects, access to hosts, any of this stuff. So the first thing I did was go to my own professional network, and a recommendation came along for an agency called Pod People. They were an agency that my former employer had worked with, and an editor that I was friends with said good things, and I just pursued a few places, but they seemed to really understand what I was going for. They really took the time to understand the style of podcasts I wanted to do, what budget I had to work with, and they were very detail-oriented about what they could achieve based on what we had to spend. And that's how we got buy-in. They put together a beautiful deck. Here's what we recommend. Here's what we can do for this price, that I was able to then just show to my boss, hey, this is a legit organization. It's going to be within budget, and we're going to get the product that we really are envisioning here, and not just a simulacrum of that. It was going to be the real deal.
Right. And I think that, based on what you just shared, there's a big learning point to take away from that experience. And that is that there is a world out there of brands, maybe not operating at the intersection of media and product as you are, but brands that are interested in telling these stories. And because they have marketing departments, because they have internal comms and PR, there is oftentimes this idea that says, okay, well, we can piece this part of the puzzle together and do it on our own. Some make the mistake of going, how hard can it be? And there's a lesson to take away from the fact that at this piece of the production pipeline for you, it sounds like it went relatively smoothly because you sought out a partner. And I think that's huge. We're here talking to folks that work on podcasts currently, hosted by Lower Street, who also, partners with folks to do this kind of work. And I think it's really important to highlight this idea that partnering with people who have the skills and expertise to help you execute your vision in a space that isn't otherwise often explored by your organization is paramount, right? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And having the right partner is everything. They really understood what we were going for. And it's like any good editor-creator relationship, is they really have to be simpatico for the product to actually sing, because you both share the same vision. And you both have different responsibilities to see that vision through. And it requires a lot of mutual trust and understanding to make it better than any of you could make it just on your own. And that really happened. I mean, we had a whole team of people. We had somebody who was just responsible for production management, making sure all of our deadlines were met. We had a writer who was sending me drafts of scripts every week. We had a producer who was going out to find the sources for stories. I mean, it was a real operation, but we were a team. The people that we interacted with didn't keep changing. It was a very solid team. They were dedicated to this project. And I would say they were like my second work family during this project. And we all just had such a blast together, which really makes working with an agency, not everybody has that experience. So I think taking the time to really vet the agency is paramount.
Absolutely. And so, I'm glad you provided a great segue there, because I want to talk about what that work relationship looked like, um, what the steps for actual production look like. Again, if we're tracking the timeline, you have this idea, you create that leadership buy-in, you find a partner, everybody's bought in on this idea that you're going to work with the partner to produce this product. You've already identified the fact that the other Wine Enthusiast podcast was a little bit of a lower production lift, in the sense that you can have people call in from other places and things like that. But for this, you have sound design elements you want to execute on, you have interviews you want to execute on. So what went into those next steps? What resources were involved in sort of finding that story driven sound that ultimately winds up being the product?
Absolutely. So it was consistent and consistent meeting. Once you got your dedicated team and everybody on that team had a responsibility, we met at least once a week. Like as a team, would do a stand-up of where we were at with everything. We had a production calendar we worked on that was just tracking source outreach, story ideas, script process, editing process. I mean, there were trackers for everything. So for me, on my end, it was only a small sliver of my job every week to work on this podcast. But for the Pod People team, it was clear that they were spending hours a day on this, and it was their main job. And that's another benefit of working with an agency, because I didn't have the luxury of making it. Trust me, I would love nothing more than my full-time job to be doing crime podcasts, especially in the wine space. But the reality is it was just a sliver. That's why it was such a delightful sliver, because I really had a team of people I could trust to get it done. But they were constantly sending me ideas for hosts. I remember when they sent me a portfolio of different voices they thought in their network that I would be interested in, and I could narrow it down from there. Same thing with sound design, music. They would give me options based on what they knew my interests and goals were, and then I could make a selection from there. So it was never so overwhelming I couldn't get to it. Everything that was presented to me was curated, and I chose from that curated list. It was constant, but we did it pretty quickly. I was just thinking through when you said, what did the workflow look like? I believe we reached out to in the fall, and the podcast launched in the spring. So it was only 6 episodes, but that was a lot of corralling and, again, sliver of my time, but a lot of Pod People's time to get it done that quickly. But we would always, we set them up with ideas from our editorial team of stories that we wanted to tell. And then what Pod People did from there was investigate to see who they could get on record. How many people would be willing to talk who are involved in these stories, which is not something necessarily that is such a detriment on the print content side, because you can write around a source not being there, but it's harder to do that on audio because you need the audio to help move the story along. So you're not just hearing from the host. So some stories fell through because we couldn't get sources. Others worked out just great. It was a whole process.
Really interesting, and what a great observation. And something you said that I think is really interesting is that that the story finding is getting done by the partner, and that the results of some of that are being brought back to you, and effectively you're operating as a producer. And I think there's something to be said about what that relationship looks like, especially when you're talking about a piece of brand storytelling, and in this case, a brand podcast, that when brands learn to operate as producers in the capacity that you are operating as a producer, there is a greater opportunity, I think, to achieve the outcome that everybody wants at the end of the day, which is a piece of content that people would choose to engage with, regardless of, who cut the check, right? I feel like that is a huge part of the goal in telling a great story, and in especially for your really wise goal at the outset, which was to foster brand growth by reaching new audience. Well, we reach new audiences by telling them stories that they would engage with in their regular time and space as they sit down to, in whatever moment of their life to enjoy a story. That reminds me phrasing it that way reminds me that the other thing that I wanted to say that I love about podcasts in particular is that you don't have to just sit down to enjoy them, right? Is that they have this unique ability to sort of penetrate the heart and mind without needing to take so much of your full attention that you have to dedicate all of it to that. We go on walks and listen to podcasts, we drive and listen to podcasts, we do our laundry. And I think that is why it's such a smart storytelling medium, especially for brands who are trying to reach people who already kind of have their shows and their movies and their things figured out. It's like, let's find an opportunity to connect with them at a period or a point in time where they might be able to be doing something else or to reach them in a moment that isn't otherwise being reached. So as I say all that, I want to ask you this because it's really interesting to hear how that process went for you. We kind of already touched on this idea that there was a bit of a learning moment around seeking sponsorship, but I'm curious about any other, surprises, challenges, or learning moments you experienced along the way as they relate to production, that you may have experienced, good, bad, or otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. I learned so much. First of all, I had never launched a podcast before, from scratch. So I had nothing to do but learn. And that's why I kind of laugh and say it was a song and a prayer because we just wanted to tell a really good story. And it seems lofty. Tell a good story, attract people you don't already attract, and the rest will follow. So we had this kind of magical thinking about it, which honestly, I think from the creative standpoint is the best starting place. It's what helps you keep the end user always top of mind when you're trying to think of a great story to tell, just for the sake of telling it. It gets cloudy when you start thinking like sometimes I'll wonder, okay, well, this wasn't we weren't able to actually get sponsors. That was a big learning for me and the publisher because we thought it's wine related. It speaks to a broader audience. It'll be a win-win for our clients to also reach those different audiences for their own brands to get exposure. And we thought there were some pretty cool wine brands out there that align pretty well with a crime related title. But what we found really in our endemic client base was a skittishness because crime was involved. And so they were afraid to spend their money on a product they didn't know, that wasn't tested yet, that was based around crime. It was a tougher sell. But I also think if I would have put the commercial interests of our advertisers first, I probably wouldn't have had the commercial recognition and the industry recognition in terms of audio success on podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple if I thought about it in the reverse. So I don't think that was an exact answer to your question. I mean, but to me, that was the biggest surprise is you don't just put out great content and it generates revenue. And that I was a bit naive about. I just thought, create a great story. And I should know better. I should know better in terms of my career in digital media that you don't just write it and they come. but I think the storytelling was better for it, honestly.
No, I think that's a great answer. And it's an interesting trade-off when you think about it. It's like a full-fledged commitment to what would draw in an audience, especially in this case, would have required maybe a little more bravery on the part of a brand partner. And nobody you spoke to seemed to have that bravery, which, let's be honest, is their loss because this is a great podcast. It's so much fun. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that everybody here takes the time to go and listen to all 6 episodes because I really do think it's not only is it great fun, it's so unique, and it is done with such quality that it so easily sits alongside all of the best podcasts that we all like to listen to and aspire to create. And so in saying that, I want to ask you, when it came to the moment to put this out into the world, you've got this product, you're confident about this product in the sense that it's me. I imagine it met, if not exceeded, what you had imagined. And now it's time to go find that audience that you talked about at the very beginning. So I'm curious, how did you roll out the show? And what did the marketing aspect or interest building aspect of that part of this project look like?
Yeah, so this is where it helps to be at an established media and commerce company, is that I started by the obvious, which was using the outlets we already had to reach our current core audience for Wine Enthusiast. So that included running ads in our print magazine with QR codes to download the episode. We had an ad in our annual Wine Star Award event to generate interest, which is it's like a black tie event, which is the Oscars of the wine industry that we call it. So a lot of brands were there to see the exposure and listen to it for themselves. We also did ads and stitches on our main podcast, the Wine Enthusiast podcast, and promoted it there, running the trailer there before taking people over to the Vinfamous location. We also did a social campaign, newsletter promotions, run of site on our website for banner ads. And the biggest thing we did was run a promotion within the first week of launch, where we would tie in a wine cellar, small 32 bottle unit, which is one of our most popular units, run a giveaway in exchange for, if you download that would be one of the incentives for you to win this unit. And all of that combined really was a tremendous help. But we also used help too in getting on the radar of other podcasts that were almost like sister or brother podcasts. So podcasts in our space that were similar sizes who would do cross promotion with us. So we would run ads for them. They would run ads for us, host read. And that was another way we increased our footprint. So all of that, and beyond our wildest dreams, we were #1 on Apple within 48 hours of launch for downloads in the food category. And we maintained that spot for about 15 days. And we also made top lists on Spotify in their arts category. So that was just early validation that we did something right, and that this was a success. And then later came more critical awards like Signal. We got 2 Signal awards, one for best episode, one for best series. And then I got introduced to brand storytelling, and I went to your brand storytelling event out in Park City and got to speak on a panel there. So there are all these not hidden, but less maybe obvious ways where the Wine Enthusiast brand continues to get out there and is continuing to get on the radar of audience that Wine Enthusiast isn't hitting daily already. So in that way, we really consider it a success.
That's really awesome to hear. And the fact is that it's well earned and well deserved. You'll hear me continue to gush about the quality of this podcast and how much fun it is. I do want to double back to something that you said that I think is interesting to explore, especially when you're approaching this from the perspective of operating internally at a brand and looking for support from other teams. You mentioned that you were kind of able to get all this placement for the podcast, run of site, et cetera, et cetera. That involves, some cross communication across departments. And I'm wondering, did that come easily, or what did that look like? How was there enthusiasm from other teams? Was it coming from the top down, like, hey, everybody needs to get on board? What did that part look like?
Yes, I told everyone if they want to keep their jobs, they have to promote Vinfamous and make my dreams come true. No, I do. From where I sit as the VP of content, I do have very easy and direct access cross-functionally at the company. So I sit on our leadership team. And so I have direct relationship with our CMO. I have direct relationship with our publisher. So getting access to those teams and getting the support is really not difficult. It's really all in just what we do in a day. We have a marketing team built in, and that's why we're able to get things like run of site and social promotion and newsletter promotion quite easily, because the creative department is creating the asset, the marketing team just executes on it, and it's what they do anyway for any other product that we generate, whether that's a wine fridge or it's a magazine article. It all gets the same standard baseline treatment. So anything we did extra was, on me and the team at Pod People to add to that mix.
Just think that in itself is a huge win. The fact that that is the structure and that there's that level of communication. And it really seems to me that that has everything to do with where you sit in the leadership structure and where you're connected. Because there are moments where there might be somebody who isn't quite in that position that is trying to champion this story and has to kind of speak up the ladder to that person. And I just want to reinforce this idea that like creating that buy-in is everything, right? Whether your storefront is a digital storefront or a literal storefront, if you are working on a brand podcast and that is not being promoted in all of the assets that you have, that's not quite a win. That's a miss. So to hear that that was done in such a cohesive way, I think is a huge driver of visibility. And I'm not sure if you looked to measure exactly what correlation that had with your listenership, but I would imagine that's huge and that it doesn't really get done as well without that.
Oh, absolutely. I
Right.
think the reason why we hit really early metrics was because I was operating within a brand that already had a stronghold with their own audience. So you leverage that audience to amplify your message. So anything that outside of the Wine Enthusiast core marketing package treatment, if you will, was only just incremental, and it all helped. So it also just, for me, what was really interesting is, so Pod People would give us these reports on metrics and how things were doing. And our core audience on Wine Enthusiast is male and 45 plus. And what we found from the Vinfamous stats were that majority of listeners were female between the ages of 35 and 44. So it's a small detail like that that maybe was lost on somebody else on the executive team. But for me, knowing that brand awareness was the first goal of this, that to me shows, despite even with #1 spots and all the sexier things, the fact that we hit a different demo, that one detail point is proof positive that this kind of brand marketing works, and that you need to support it. And getting buy-in is absolutely, you're going to need to do that at every stage, because though I didn't have to work so hard to get internal buy-in, I had to work really hard with our sales team to get external buy-in for that sponsorship. And so we had to go deep into pulling some data and statistics, not only on the early success we had with Vinfamous, which it took time to get all those accolades, right? Just hitting the record of the top lists was the most immediate thing, but the rest took time. So right off the offset, we had to really do research, how willing audio listeners are to take action with an ad versus somebody who gets served a banner ad. So there's really, whenever you're looking to get buy-in from anybody in a suit, if you will, numbers always talk. Because even sometimes in my day job, I find it hard to say, but the story's so good and we have to tell a story. And really the numbers are what get you in the door. Show them stats on how podcasts and how brand marketing actually does lift the success of a company. How does it show on their bottom line? If not directly, indirectly over time. Find whatever numbers and framing you can to then pitch the story and get buy-in.
That's so interesting, and I think that it's really good to hear from you directly this idea that there different departments are going to view success differently. And if you can speak directly to those departments and find the way to define that success, as you said, success, the way it was defined for you, may have been different for sales, may have been different for anybody else. And yet the internal interoperability and the cohesion there, and the vision and the strategy all coalesced in such a way that everybody was kind of able to get back those results that they were seeking and see some movement, some positive movement. And I think that's huge and something that everyone should consider, regardless of whether or not their podcast is being produced with a partner or independently, is, how can you move the needle in a few different ways and make sure that all those value goals are met. I think it makes for it's a good exercise when you're working to build out your strategy, and it's a good measurement tool when it comes to once you've published and put it out in the world, to check in and see how that all was delivered in relationship to that strategy. And this is such a great example of that. I kind of want to close our conversational portion here before we go to some Q&A, just by asking you, you mentioned that you learned a lot, that this was a big learning experience for you. We have an audience of folks who are working in the same space, telling their stories, and putting wonderful stories together. And I'm wondering if you have any takeaways, whether they're for, like I said, independent podcasters, for brand teams seeking to work on podcasts, anyone in between. Do you have any takeaways for them, considering what you learned along the way?
Yeah, I think hindsight is 2020. And I go back and forth on this. Was Vinfamous a success or not? Because it didn't get a sponsor, for example. It didn't generate revenue. But then you look at all the brand awareness and that you actually achieved what we set out to do. What I learned is what I probably would do again differently is really hone in on what the goal is of the podcast before launching it, because I think I was thinking and just more excited about, let's try something new and acquire a new audience and see where it goes. And then the reality of not being able to do another season because it needed to have investment behind it and constant payment to make something of this high quality. How was it going to pay for itself? The company is not Netflix. We're not going to operate at a loss year over year over year in the name of good content. We also have to dedicate our resources financially responsibly. So I think I would have taken more time at the outset to really narrow down and put a tighter focus on, what do I want this product to achieve in order of importance? Because then I think I would have had less self-doubt or back and forth on, was this successful? Was it not? Depends on how you look at it. How are you measuring it? I didn't have some fine-tuned, okay, here is the mission of this is what it's going to achieve. I didn't have any of that really structured out. And I think if I had taken that work early on, it would have been a nice compass for me for when I was feeling like, damn, we can't get a sponsor. Like, what are we doing? I could go back to that original mission statement and objectives document and say, wait, you are actually, yes, you're hitting exactly what you set out to do. It just focuses everything. It focuses your own attention. It focuses on how you ask for things and what you're asking for. So I would do more of that in the beginning.
Absolutely. I think that's great advice. And thank you for sharing. I've really enjoyed talking to you about this, and we're going to go to the group for some questions now. And Nathan, you can take it away there.
Yeah, thank you both. That was excellent. I love where we landed too, because it's almost the beginning, right? Like that strategy piece, it's the first island you set your foot on, and thinking through, like, why are we doing this? What's the purpose? And I think sometimes hindsight's 2020, like it's easier for you to say that now, but you're going through the initial project and like it may have changed. That might have evolved over time. So yeah, thank you both. That's really excellent. And I guess my first question is, what's up with season 2? How can we find you a sponsor? It's
How
so
can
good.
we? I'm taking bids. Person, $5. Do I have $5? No.
Beautiful.
That's
Drop
exactly
it in the
right.
chat.
So the first bidder wins. We actually have planned stories that we are wanting to tell. We have a backlog, and a fun tidbit I have to say is there's a podcast out now called Blood Vines, and it's on Wondery. And the journalist's name is Chris, and I'm blanking on his last name. I was just in touch with him, so apologies, but he came to us months and months and months ago because he heard Vinfamous, and he said, I saw what you did here. We'd love for Wine Enthusiast to be the platform in which we tell this story. Now, they came to us before Wondery. Now, we can't compete with Wondery. Like, we did not have the money, again, to invest in a podcast that we didn't know what the result would be, because we would have launched our own season 2 of Vinfamous ourselves, right? But here we are, we opened this door where these really talented creators, because they heard Vinfamous, are coming to us, and they're recognizing us as a platform for excellent storytelling. That was just, it was a nod to me from the universe that, hey, your team created something really cool and viable here. And even the producers at Wondery, they were second on this person's list to go to as an outlet. And again, that's brand recognition in a way that I never could have planned for. But I can tell you the interest is there to do a second season, a third season, a fourth season. But where we're at as a company, we're a small family-owned company. We really do need the external investment to make it work.
Sure. Sure. And it's a good note. It's a good reality so that folks understand that. I want to go to Rob's question, because I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about your core demo being males 45 plus. And then you found that this show really resonated with a female audience. I missed the age, maybe you said it. But his question was, has that data on the new demo, did that alter your content strategy in other areas outside of the podcast? Perhaps as a
Not entirely, because the way we do digital content is we create it in such a way that we consider the distribution outlet of where that piece of content is going. So for example, we have a series on wine basics. That is a real search play. People Googling before ChatGPT came on board. That's a whole nother thing. But people were Googling how do you swirl a wine glass? What is the difference between Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc? Anything that people would Google because they were too embarrassed to ask other people, they were coming to us through Wine Basics. That's obviously not going to be somebody who gets our magazine, where we have our ratings and reviews, deeper thought pieces on the industry. It's a different level of consumer. So our digital content has always spoken to a variety of consumer in that way. I would say what we did utilize that for was running in-house ads for our retail space. So our commerce company benefits from the fact that we have a media product in which they can run ads on. So that was exposure for them, who maybe their catalog buyer, for example, is 60 plus, and male, and they weren't reaching the 35-year-old or 44-year-old female who likes wine. We have plenty of accessories. We have things that appeal to both and all genders and gender identities. And so this was an opportunity for them to get exposure for the fact that we're not just a media brand. We sell wine products too.
Right. Interesting. I want to jump to Haley's question in the Q&A chat here. What was, and I believe this is in terms of promotion, what was one type of marketing you found most effective?
Yeah. Giveaways. When you have to incentivize somebody to take an action. Yeah. When you have to incentivize somebody to take an action in order to get something, works every damn time. That's not the sexy answer, but it's the real answer.
Was there a secondary channel to that? Like, was social a feature in that? I guess, what did the marketing play look like?
Yeah, well, we hit everything. So I don't think in-house ads were as popular as the social ads. So playing like what you saw in the beginning, that trailer and the teaser, being able to drop those audio teasers on social media, which already is reaching, I'm talking Instagram, was already reaching a bit of a younger audience in general, was an easy win and crossover.
Got it. Cool. Thanks for that. Over to Mary's question. She actually put this in the chat early on. I thought it was a great one. Were you able to prove the growth in audience and reduction in attrition to your higher ups after the success of season one?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, everyone unequivocally agrees that this was a success from a brand standpoint. But who's going to fund it? And so marketing isn't yet willing. Again, we're a small company. This would be probably a no-brainer for a Disney, somebody of that scale, where the cost of developing a podcast is irrelevant. But at a smaller mom and pop company, you really look at what is going to be the most bang for your buck. And the podcast does not weigh heavily there, even though it was a brand success. So everyone agrees it has all this potential, and it clearly is proven worthwhile. We have other priorities that we need to hit in terms of using our marketing budget.
Got it. Got it. This question is from Frank, to both of you, actually. What advice would you give marketers who want to tell better stories but don't have an obvious drama or the like kind of baked into their brand?
I'll take that one first. I would say that the answer is you have to go back and examine values. If we're going to use Dara's example, I think that what you look at is that spark that came from asking that question, what would I want to listen to? And then there's a B part, and the B part is what do you want audiences to know that they don't already know? What's at the intersection of those two things? What sparks your interest, and what do you think people could learn more and know more about? It doesn't necessarily have to be rooted in a drippy drama the way that Vinfamous is. That just happened to be the thing that worked best for you. But the thing that worked best for Wine Enthusiast isn't going to be the best thing that works for everybody. So I think it really means going back and looking at those values and considering what works there. At Brand Storytelling, we have a community of hundreds of brands and lots of industry partners, podcast producers, film producers, all of whom are asking this same question. And it always comes back to this idea of, well, what is the organic story that already kind of is there, that exists, that people might not be tapped into? For some people, that might be customer stories. For some people, that might be stories about a place. So I think it really comes back to examining what those resources that exist are, and then drawing on those to make sure that you're telling the best story possible.
Yeah, I would second that. And it goes back to what I was saying about knowing your objectives first. If you know what your goal is with the content or with your marketing plan, then you can better fit how the story is going to get towards that objective. Always starting with that objective, I think, is really key, because good storytelling does get lost if it's not supported with the right infrastructure, the right packaging. It could be the right story in the wrong platform. You always have to see what the objective is, and that's really going to shape the story and how you tell the story.
So I love that point, because it's like the incredible painter painting in a cabin in the woods, right? But no one ever gets to see it. So I think that's a really important thing to kind of close on here is, even though you've created a high content, beautifully, done show with a great story, there is a lot of steps that need to be in place to follow that, and to ensure that success becomes available to that product effectively. What advice would you give folks who are, in your position a few years ago with this idea in their head, but not having gone through the steps, working with a production team, thinking about distribution, thinking about promotion? What advice would you give them to take that first step? And I guess the secondary question there is, do you still think that the time is now to do that, to step forward and put those great stories out there?
I mean, always. I got my MFA a couple of years ago, and it was quite an interesting thing to go to school later in life when you actually wanted to be there. You learn a lot more and you take away a lot from it. And what I took from that experience was a reminder that your stories are important. The stories you're telling matter. And you can't judge every piece of creative that you operate based on commercial success. Get your stories out there for the sake of the next person who has a great story to tell and needs to find a way. You really have to love the craft in order to do it without the commercial success or reward. And if you stick at it and you keep learning by doing it constantly, it's going to happen. The universe will break, it'll find a path. That's why I said with Vinfamous, I felt like a lot of the universe was just paving the path for me. Things kind of fell into place, but there was a lot before that, right? That didn't. But you keep going out there and you keep taking those risks and you keep learning. If you stop, then what do we have as a society in terms of art, right? So don't ever stop.
If I could add to that just briefly,
yes, please.
Say that to answer the portion of the question that says, is now a good time? The answer is yes, yes, yes. Historically, moments of discord are the ones where people engage the most with art and look to art to make sense of the world they're in. We're all experiencing a lot in the United States right now, no matter what side of the voting aisle you're on, no matter who you are, we're all experiencing a lot right now. And so I think that when you look back at as far back as the Great Depression, and then again in 2008 and again in COVID, you'll see that people turn to stories. That these are when podcasts boom. These are when stories boom. So if you're ready to go. Tell your story. People need it.
I love that. Thank you for that message. And I love that we revolved all the way around to talking about podcasts as art, because that's how I think about it. And I think it's true. Thank you both so much. This was really a great discussion. Thank you for your time and thank you for being part of this creative community. A quick heads up to everyone who's still on. This session will be live on Lower Street site in about 24 hours. So there will be the replay available and forever free. Thank you guys, and thanks to everyone for being here, and we hope to see you here the next time.